Chapter 9. The First Footprints in the Snow. Tom's birthday morning, 6:30 a.m. Gosh, that's very early. It had snowed steadily through the night. Tom was up and dressed very early. He was excited because at last it really and finally was his 12th birthday. He was also excited because, as expected, it had snowed. Outside lay the first deep snow of winter. He dressed in his warmest clothes, buckled on his practice sword and leather scabbard, picked up his wooden shield and crept quietly down to the kitchen. He couldn't see any birthday parcels anywhere. He was hoping for a real blade, an adventurer's sword, as his special present. His mother must still be asleep. He let himself out into a garden that had been transformed by snow. Fresh snow, perfect for first footprints. At first, he just walked round and round. He made lots of deep, crisp prints, and then he took a small, hard rubber ball from under his adventurous tunic. Every morning he practiced catching. He threw the little ball up against the wall of the house or the high part of the fence. He tried to catch it 100 times in a row without a drop. He had got as far as 80 on his best effort. He would swap hands and try one hand catching, one hand throwing the ball under his raised leg and throwing the ball under his raised leg. He would sometimes make diving catches and try and scoop the ball just before it hit the ground. Good training, his brother said, for his reflexes. Then he pulled his wooden sword out from the scabbard on his tunic belt. He held it out in front of him and practiced some strokes with it. He lunged and swiped at imaginary enemy knights or terrifying giants. He had watched his bigger brothers enough times as they had trained to know just how many strokes it would take. There was a strict warrior code, and all fights and battles had to be governed by the rules. First he bowed to show respect to his enemy. Then he lined the tip of his sword against the garden fence where he had drawn some targets. There were fake chalked outlines of knights in armours, hobgoblins, witches and trolls. He raised the sword again and lined it against his nose, and then he quietly spoke the family motto as his brothers always did, "With a true heart." Then using both hands he brought the toy sword down very fast. It made a loud crack, wood on wood, as it hit the fence. The crack repeated and echoed through the surrounding forest. It disturbed a flock of birds who all flew up at once, cawing and squawking in alarm. Then the world went quiet again. Tom sheathed the sword and looked up at the dark sky. A few flakes of tingling snow were still falling and settling in the branches overhead. Then he noticed that a big black crow was sitting perched on their weather vane. It made a perfect target. He quickly gathered up some snow and pressed it together into his hands, making a hard, tight snowball. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, as if it had been waiting to get his attention, the crow spoke to him. Tom stared up at the bird in disbelief. The crow shook itself, fluffed up its feathers, and sat there swaying for the moment. Then it spoke to him again. Tom dropped the snowball. He stared at the bird, and the bird tilted its head on one side and stared back at him. "What did you just say?" Tom asked, astonished. "Caw, caw!" It seemed to be mocking him, staring at him with its beady eyes. "No, you said something else. There were real words. You spoke to me." "Caw!" said the crow again. "No, there were proper words. One of them sounded like porridge," Tom said. "I said you'll need courage, Tom," repeated the crow clearly, and it sounded as close as a friendly whisper in Tom's ear. Then the crow flew up, circled around the house, lazily flapped its wings in the cold air. Tom stared up at the bird. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The crow had actually spoken, and to him. Tom Trueheart. Things like this never happened to him. He had only heard about them in stories his brothers had told, or in the books he had read. This was his own first-hand experience of, well, magic. His 12th birthday, and something exciting had finally and really happened. He ran back into the house. "Hey, Mum," he called out, breathless with excitement. "Guess what? A crow in the garden just spoke to me. Really and truly spoke to me." He ran up the stairs 2 steps at a time and burst straight into her bedroom. "Mum," he said, all breathless and excited now that his words tumbled over themselves to get out. "There was this big black crow on the roof in the snow, and it said real words to me. It's finally happened, my first real bit of true magic." And then he paused. The little wooden cuckoo clock ticked quietly on the wall. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. It was a peaceful room and smelt of lavender. "You're up early," said his mother finally, sitting straight up and rubbing her eyes. "Happy birthday, Tom," she said with a smile. "Mum," he said, "a crow spoke to me in the garden, a big black one. It spoke to me." "Me," Tom said, pointing at himself. "Calm down now," she said. "What do you expect? It is your 12th birthday after all, Tom. That's when things really start to happen to the young men in this family. Goodness, look at all that snow, and no one left to bank the fire up now, except your poor old mother." "I can do it for you now, Mother. Don't you worry," said Tom eagerly. "I know you can, my boy, but it's not the fire I'm worried about," said his mother, shaking his head. "Still no sign of your brothers, I suppose?" she said wearily. "I prayed so hard that they could all be back by now. My poor young Tom. Never mind, we shall try and have a happy birthday breakfast with just the 2 of us at least." She wrapped herself in her warm dressing gown, and together they went down to the kitchen. Tom sat down at the big kitchen table. He was surrounded by empty chairs and empty place settings. They seemed especially empty and forlorn on this morning of all mornings. He hoped he would soon be given his special birthday present, or at least the little birthday crown, anything to cheer things up a bit. One by one his brothers had all gone away, far off on their story adventures, being heroes and princes and the like. They had all promised faithfully to come back in time for today. They hadn't come back though. Not one single one of them. Not one of his brothers had kept their promise. This was his most important birthday ever, but they were too busy being princes, no doubt, and living it up. It was so unfair. He bit his lip, suddenly trying very hard to hold back a tear. He sat for a moment and listened to his mother humming bravely to herself as she made his breakfast. He ate his birthday porridge, creamy and thick and sweetened with honey. His mother had brought out the little gold cardboard crown she kept specially for birthday breakfast, and Tom wore it as he ate. "I fear that something has happened to them, you know, Tom," his mother said. "I'm sure of it now." She went over to the range and made herself a big, comforting mug of tea. "They are big enough and brave enough boys, and they're full of courage and cunning, but there are forces out there," and she shook her head and looked out at the snow and shivered. Sorcery was what she meant. It was always a possibility, Tom thought. It was just then that he noticed the envelope. It was propped up against a big beer tankard on the table right in front of him. Why hadn't he seen it before? "Look, Mum, a birthday card," he said, reaching across for it. It was a beautiful, big, oblong envelope. There's a picture of one. Made on expensive-looking, heavy cream parchment. His mother started to speak. "Tom, I'm afraid it won't be your she said with a deadened certainty what this envelope might mean. But Tom interrupted her before she could get the words out. "Mum," he called again, "look, it really is for me." Tom had noticed the neatly formed, thick black writing across the top of the envelope. It read, "From the Master of the Story Bureau, private and very strictly confidential." Below that, in bolder black handwriting, it said, "For the attention of Thomas Trueheart, Esquire." He read it twice, slowly to himself. There was no doubt about it. It said Thomas, not Jack. The letter was really meant for him, and for him alone. He held the thick, heavy envelope for a moment, weighing it in his hand. There seemed to be sheets and sheets of paper inside. His mother watched him anxiously, her mouth turned down, with a look of worry and sadness, even fear upon her face. The envelope might contain terrible news, something they really wouldn't want to know. Tom's mother turned and looked out of the window. She noticed the crow. It had settled in the garden, and she knew straight away that it must have been the one that had just spoken to Tom. by the way it was looking at the house. The big bird was not at all sinister. It looked as if it was just simply watching and waiting, like a good friend of Tom's that had come round to play in the garden. She raised her hand and gave a little wave to the bird. She felt silly doing it, but somehow felt she must. The bird bobbed its head once in reply, and she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Yes, very well then. If that was how it must be, she made up her mind and turned back again as Tom finally tore open the envelope and pulled out and unfolded all the sheets of paper from inside. And we will be reading the last chapter in part 1 next, chapter 10.